Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session. We're very pleased to have so many of you in person, online, and from a very large range of backgrounds. What we're going to share with you in this session is some work that we've produced, research findings from our work with federal, state, and local educators of police. We've called it, as you can see from this first slide, the art of the possible.
Introduce yourself, I think.
I don't think we're unmuted.
Sorry, folks, we're just having a technical issue here.
Okay, great. Sorry.
Okay, sorry, we're just getting ourselves set up in the studio, folks.
Is that recorded?
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
it's starting.
My apologies.
Okay, and you'll introduce yourself.
Apologies.
Sorry, folks, we're just.
Okay, I'm Mary Kalantzis. I'm a professor of education in the College of Education at the University of Illinois. And my job is to welcome you to this particular session, which shares the research work that we have done with federal, state and local educators of police around what we call the art of the possible. Right. And why do we call it the art of the possible? I mean, certainly I think you'd all agree that we're living in times that are ever-changing and increasingly contested. And in particular, as a consequence of the new technology that has permeated all our lives. What does that mean for education of police and preparing them for the kind of large range of responsibilities that they have? That is what we're going to share with you today. The microphone's working?
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah.
Okay. Okay, so if we could just move to the next slide. We are going to share with you the work that's emerged from our research around the 8 principles for technology-supported learning. If technology has made such a big difference in the lives of police, in the lives of ordinary people, in the lives of educators, how do we harness it? And is the traditional way in which education is delivered, you know, the classroom, the textbook, the exam at the end, the best way to prepare folks for the kind of world that they have to engage with at this point in time? And of course, we'd like to say at the very beginning that the first iteration of the use of technology or digital technology has not always been as innovative and as engaging as it could be, because it kind of mirrored that traditional classroom. So what our 8 principles are about, and Dr. Bill Cope here and Jen Whiting will be speaking about these 8 principles, is how do we harness that technology and how do we address the changing and increasingly contested environment. We kind of call it cyber social. So we're not only looking at cyber and the digital in terms of the technology and the tools, but also the humans that engage with it and what it means. So these 8 principles deal with issues of access, engagement, work-life integration, cooperative learning, peer learning, and also the tools for designing in this environment the kind of learning experiences that will be more transformative for learner participants. And of course, how do we then evaluate in this more complex context what they're learning? So I'm going to hand over now to my colleagues, Dr. Cope and Jen Whiting, to elaborate on these 8 principles.
Okay, welcome everybody, and good to have you here at this conference. Just to give you a little bit of a background, this research work that we did was with the federal law enforcement training centers, and those centers, there's one particular physical infrastructure in Glencoe in Georgia, and there are a couple of other major sites around the United States. And in a way, they're like a conventional college or university campus. People come from out of town, they do this intensive training, and they go back. And the federal law enforcement centers deal with 100 odd federal agencies, including border police and maritime, and a whole lot of really quite critical aspects of policing right across the United States. They also do training for small police forces that don't have their own training institutes, and they're also involved in training police used in Native communities as well, in Native American communities. So that's just a little bit of their brief. And I wanted to sort of fit you in a little bit about the background. Jen and I spent a number of days there looking at the work that they did on this campus, with a view to thinking, well, look, how might digital tools supplement what happens there, but also allow for some of it to happen remotely, not necessarily have to come to the campus. So that's what we had in mind. But I want to give you a little picture of that place, just a sense of what it is that we saw. So we saw conventional lecture rooms where people sat and listened to the instructor talking about stuff. We also saw a firearms range. We saw a whole lot of simulations of, there was a simulated town where it was possible to role play various things that police might have to deal with in that town. We kind of facetiously thought it was like an extension of Disney World down the road or something, but it was Disney World for police, which is this place where you a town where you thought through all these issues. And we also saw, interestingly, a number of lecture theatres where at the front was a scene where things would get acted out, if you like, and the people in their rows of the trainees in their rows of seats would sit and watch. So in a way, that became a kind of a counterpoint for us. We also saw very interesting new work happening there, including work around simulators and virtual reality, and people thinking about what the next generation of learning in these kinds of environments would be like. But also, and this is our first point now, we've got eight takeaways that we thought would be possible ways in which police education and training might happen in the future. And one is accessibility, which is lightweight web-based infrastructure. Now, students will come to class with these things, their own devices or their laptops. So how might the devices that students bring to class be part of the learning experience? And one of the important parts of police training is, this is just one example, is various kinds of physical encounter, which are problematic: arresting somebody, handcuffing somebody, dealing with somebody who where some kind of physical interaction might be needed with the person. And at the moment, what happens is, that's perhaps done with role playing in a person-to-person context, but also just as an example, one of the things we thought about these lightweight web-based infrastructures, if a video is made of an interaction, it's possible to parse that interaction very carefully, perhaps peers parsing that interaction. And so one of the possibilities we thought was using these digital recording things and then uploading them into a learning management system to talk about what happens and to deconstruct what that interaction's like. And in a way, what we felt was a lot of what could occur in this next generation of infrastructures doesn't necessarily involve heavy duty expensive equipment, but what it does involve is these web infrastructures where it's possible to build recording, store stuff in a repository, comment on things, talk about things. So that was our first point. The second point, now, Jen, before we go into this, let's go back to the first point just for a second. Jen, you were there as well. Anything else that you would like to say about that as well?
I just think that it's so important for us to look at the nature of the student that's coming to this campus and to all three of the federal law enforcement training center campuses. Many of them are coming out of college environments. There are federal officers, and so they've been involved with digital learning management systems, typically in high schools and colleges. And I think that leveraging that web-based infrastructure that they're already familiar with into the curriculum that they're encountering as federal officers it's just a win-win.
Yes, absolutely. And actually one of the aspects of the innovative work they were doing at the Glencoe campus was implementing their version of Moodle. They had an FLETC set up as well. So they were beginning to move in this direction in some interesting kinds of ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so let's move on to our second point now, which is balanced engagement. So, I've been beginning to talk this through, to discuss this already in the first point. But, one of the things about traditional lecture format, a traditional classroom format, is the learners are positioned in a relatively passive kind of way. They're absorbing what's being shown to them. So one of the things is, how can we actually build an environment where there's more engagement, more activity? And these environments, particularly environments where the interaction can be recorded, allow for much more active learning than was possible in those traditional lecture kinds of formats. So Jen, something you'd like to add to that as well?
I think what you're describing, Bill, which is this idea of many educators will call it a flipped classroom,
Right.
where we've advanced beyond the teacher as the sole authority in the room, and especially with adult learners. And this is where I think we can talk about the practice of implementing an adult learning model, sometimes called andragogy, and the principles of that, where it's a self-directed environment because we're dealing with adults, not children, and they bring to it such great experience. And in many cases, in the federal law enforcement training and in state and local training, whether it's police or the jurisdictions on our native lands, they bring in expertise. Many of them are ex-military. And so they come to this training ready to balance, if you will, that engagement. And so moving away from the didactic structure that we experienced in our elementary and high schools, and moving into the adult learning model, balancing that teacher and learner input and expecting that it's not just the teacher who's doing the teaching, but the students are engaging as well in that same role as much as they can.
Yes, no, that's absolutely right. And one of the traditional aspects of police education and training is these been quasi-military boot camp type environments, effectively, which has been very much instructor dominated, because there's a culture of directedness that's there, if you like. So what we're thinking about is, how can we actually have something which is much more actively involved? And we've got a screenshot there on this slide there of environment that we've been working on here at the University of Illinois, where perhaps there's an example of a video that you might put in, which might be a role play of particular interaction. So rather than sit back in the lecture theatre and watch something happening in this theatre-like environment, everybody does it, and then they give each other feedback on what each other's done. So this is an example of balanced engagement. And of course, in this day and age where the age of TikTok and Instagram and whatever, people are very familiar with this idea of documenting things and recording things in these kinds of ways. Absolutely. So that's our second point. So let's move on to the third point now, which is collaborative knowledge creation. So, as adults, people come to, or the trainees coming into this learning environment, bring with them a wealth of life experience, right? It may be sometimes the wrong experience, but it may well be a lot of situational experience. Often they're people who've been working in some kind of role like this already, like the job they're about to take, like in a police environment. So how do we involve people as active knowledge constructors, active knowledge makers, bringing the specificity of their experience to the table? So, in a conventional lecture theatre, we assume that everybody's an empty vessel. We're going to teach them some stuff, and that what we need to teach them is uniformly the same. But in fact, people come from very different environments. There are men and there are women. There are people of different ethnic and racial backgrounds. There are people who've lived in very different types of communities. And how does one incorporate that life experience into the learning in such a way that it's productive? And the phrase that we often use is productive diversity. You know, how can, oh, look, is that how you do it where you are? Well, look, this is our experience here. So in other words, how we bring into it a dialogue around the differences there are in the world and the variety in the world and the different kinds of challenges, where the students are bringing to the learning experience their own life experiences. And we call this collaborative knowledge creation. Jen, anything more you'd like to add to that?
I think what you've touched upon, there are two presuppositions in our adult learning model and in that study. One is that adults like to be self-directed in their learning,
Right.
and coming in with that expertise that they're bringing from whatever their past experience is. But the second is that adults thrive in a collaborative environment. We expect that in the workplace. That's probably where they have had success, because most of our work is done collaboratively. And so I think transitioning that or picking that up and placing it into our learning environments is really what, and as simplistic as this sounds, as we look at all of the learning environments that we're involved in, whether it's in a police academy, our federal training, even at the university level, are we really engaging collaboratively? Are we teaching the adult students that we are interacting with? And I think it's a challenge to us as educators. Certainly, the diagram that's on this slide of the scholar environment, where projects are constructed by an individual who has something that they want to share with a team or a collection of students in an environment. But that knowledge is then exponentially developed through the engagement of the others in that team or in that class. And it is, I think that at times, certainly I see this with my peers in education at the university level, it can be a little threatening as one who was seen as the authority in the classroom to share that authority. But with adult learners, that collaboration between the students is actually what's going to drive the learning more than any individual instructor or professor could.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I might say as a little, just a footnote, we've got these screenshots there of the scholar environment. So we also, as part of this project, use the scholar environment as a demonstration of what might be possible. Background, it's been a project that we've had here at the University of Illinois to build this, knowledge sharing, collaborative learning environment, if you like, over the last 10 years or so. We've had some quite big grants to do that over the years. So what we were doing in this project is a twofold thing. One was researching the current state of play and discussing with the folks who are in the project what their needs were. But the second thing is kind of demonstrate through some of the work that we've done what a next generation learning ecology, online learning ecology might be like, both in support of in-person delivery, like the delivery that we found at Glencoe in Georgia, or remote as well. So anyhow, let's move on to the next one. And I think Jen's going to take the lead on number 4.
So integrating this campus-based, the campus-based courses with the work. I think that this allows us to look at, one, our course design and demonstrating that there is a block of knowledge, there's a block of data, there's a block of activities that can be done and perhaps would best be done before someone approaches a campus. The cost of being on a campus, both the financial cost and, as we are all noticing, the cost within our society of close contact and disruptions that may be caused by the pandemic still precipitating itself throughout our groups. So identifying that type of work within the curriculum that can be done to leverage the experience that our students are coming with, to prepare them for the environment and the body of work that they'll be experiencing within the course. So these pre-course activities, helping them identify the prior knowledge and experiences that are going to position them and, quite frankly, advance them through the curriculum that they're going to be presented when they come to campus. So all these can be done in a web-based environment, of course. That's not news at all. What I think this work that allowed us to take a peek inside this training environment highlights is that, again, going back to a collaborative approach, even before the students meet in person, can be effective. Because if they can demonstrate with their own knowledge through pre-course activities, readings and discussions, and perhaps even creating their own bits of knowledge that they can present to the group, and then that then creates discussion in an online environment, that's going to allow the curriculum to begin, not at the beginning, but partway through what has been delivered didactically and entirely in person. We can actually kickstart that. Comments on that, Bill?
Yeah. So one comment that we heard over and over again is, oh, we do this training, but we don't know what effect it has when they go out into the field as police officers. So one of the suggestions that we have, well, look, if there is a set of post-course activities, they could be deliberately integrated with the experiences of work, which is, okay, what did you find which was a surprise? How did you apply these ideas? So it could be involved in, productively linking the learning experience into the experience of work, continuing that, and actually in a way blurring the boundaries between this defined thing, which is the training, and work. Converse, the other side of the coin is pre-course activities would be a way to find out a little bit about the learners and the specificities of their experiences and where they come from before they get there. So, there are some good reasons to do this, but also the most important thing is, in our sense, is blurring the boundaries. Even when they're coming to in-person training for a defined period of time, how do you actually build a program which is more integrated with their lives at the beginning and then with their work at the end?
And I think that speaks to what you just described, that pre-course, post-course activity bookending the on-campus experience, the in-person experience. I think that is an approach that is overtaking us as we seek to, as professionals in whatever industry we're in, to continually demonstrate advancing knowledge, that the education doesn't end when the course is over. And I think that constant professional development as one of the attributes of a well-formed program is critical.
Okay,
Should
so
we
we'll
go to the
move on
next
to
one?
number 5. Yeah.
All right.
Is this you or me? Who's going to kick off with this? So again, this is, for me, this is just taking it one step further, which is work integrated online learning. So this might be, you haven't even been to the campus. It's stuff which is where you're learning on the job. But that might be stuff where people are documenting things that actually happen. These are scenarios which are real, and where people are interacting around those real experiences by sharing those experiences as videos, as write-ups, as whatever form that might take. Now, of course, there are real problems about privacy. There are challenges. Let's not call them problems. There are challenges around privacy. There's challenges around freedom of information. There's a whole lot of challenges around this. But nevertheless, what the benefits we would hope would more than compensate for the challenges. So the real question is, how do you do online learning in a way which is directly embedded into real world challenges and real world experiences that police officers are having as professionals?
I want to take that just a step further, if I can, Bill, because I think if we want that development to be perpetual of our law enforcement officers or any student, in fact, the variables that we have to consider, and especially in law enforcement, one is situational variables. Those constraints or those demands that are put on the students and the professionals, the recruits, even the veteran officers, that are the requirements of their certification, both the initial certification for their field training, and then as they advance through their field training experience, the perpetual certifications that they have to maintain. So those situational variables are external, and they're being applied externally. To embed learning into that work integration, that work integrated online learning environment, it takes into account the learner's variables, self-efficacy, one's cognitive style, one's own learning style. Maybe you learn best by watching someone else do it, or by watching yourself do to perform an act, or maybe you need to read and then listen to something. Each of these things can easily be handled. Each of those learner variables, what maybe we're in different developmental stages in our careers. You have a newly minted recruit who's just out of the academy and a veteran officer. And so they're going to be nuanced in what they are absorbing from whatever the material is. The opportunity to go back to something and re-watch it, re-experience it, re-engage in a community throughout your time. I think that can't be discounted. The embeddedness of not only the learning platform and the learning assets, if you will, the videos, the online lectures, the reading and whatnot, but the learning community itself. And I think that certainly the demands that you talked about with the Freedom of Information Act, somehow being able to integrate a learning environment that allows us as a community to talk about the nuances that are experienced all the time by our law enforcement personnel. So I think that.
Yeah, and look, there are ways to deal with the reality of the unreality reality, which is anonymizing stuff, teaching people how to anonymize stuff, teaching people how to deal with hypothetical things that might be in a not very traceable way related to real practice. Right. So yeah, I think people can do that. Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to number 6 now, which is virtual augmented reality. And I know you've done a lot of work on this, Jen, so you might like to talk about that.
So coming off of what you talked about, when we were in the Glencoe campus, we saw a lot of simulation environments where they have built entire simulations of towns, or they have driving simulators. Transitioning that into virtual and augmented reality, which is computer driven and AI driven, is a very interesting next step. Of course, we see that this can be an environment where the trainee gets to experience something through either a role play that's, if you will, packaged, or a role play that is instructor led. And the scene you see here is out of a piece of software that's being piloted right now at the University of Illinois Police Training Institute here on campus, where this is it's a software called RealSim, and they allow the instructor to affect the audio that is coming at the person who's the performer, if you will, the lead actor. And what that means is that they have a library of responses that in any given situation, the complainants might say to the officers that are arriving on the scene. It sounds simplistic, but having experienced it myself, I'm not a law enforcement officer, but having experienced it myself, it really showed me the things that trigger, if you will, my responses, and that heighten my my sense of fear or anger or feeling out of control. So this is an environment, of course, virtual and augmented reality allows us to safely and repetitively afford officers practice scenarios. Anything that you want to say about that? I just want to check my notes on this. One of the things that is being, of course, trained right now is our de-escalation principles or non-escalation principles. And so that sense of practicing the phrases that might not be innate to us, empathy phrases, practicing how to control an environment verbally before it becomes a physical interaction, sometimes known as verbal judo. These opportunities for practice with peers, and then practice on your own in a recorded way that then you can play back the video of your own performance in these environments and track through the script that was created by this instructor augmented environment. It's very interesting. And I think that this is what will move us away from a physical environment where the constraints are time, space. Of course, you can't put everyone through every environment, but to augment that with augmented reality environments, I think can move us beyond having to go to a physical campus. This is an example of what could be done post-course interaction. This is an example of what could be done in the field. I know that in speaking with colleagues at the Police Training Institute, one idea they have is, what if you could do a simulation before every time you got into a squad car? What if you could enact something that might be specific to your environment in a virtual or augmented reality scenario before you hit it, if you will, boots on the ground? And it's something to just heighten the officers' awareness of their own responses. What are their own trigger points, and what phrases do they have at the ready, so that we can learn them in an environment where you're interacting with AI instead of with a human being. Anything to add there, Bill?
No, and you know, the thing is, these are new types of experience. It's not necessarily the case that these replace other forms of learning as well. These are supplementary things where new things can be done, and hopefully there's greater depth to learning. So, you know, absolutely. Okay, so we'll move on to number 7 now. And this is particularly around peer reviews. So the classic architecture of the classroom is the teacher gives you feedback on stuff. So now the problem with that architecture, in one way or another, the teacher gives you a test, the teacher responds to something you say, the teacher, you know, there's lots and lots of ways in which the teacher can give you feedback. So one of the things is how you build systems where there is a peer feedback. So you're responsible to think critically about your peers in a context, and to give them, you know, to think like a team player, to think collaboratively, to act collaboratively. But also there's a simple logistic thing that happens with this, and that is that that in a peer review context, it's possible to get a lot more feedback. There's one teacher and 30, 40, 50 trainees, whatever the number is. It's possible for everybody to be giving and receiving feedback all the time. So one of the things we're interested in is, how does one build these systems in a structured kind of way? And these web systems are a way of managing the intrinsic complexity of peer review. That's one thing. And secondly, keeping a trace, keeping a record of everything in a way which can then contribute to assessment. And again, in the work that we've been doing here at the University of Illinois, we've been doing a lot of work into the peer review process and how your peers can give you quality feedback. And one of the reasons, one of the relatively simple ways to get quality feedback from a peer is to have a rubric, which is, these are the things you need to be measuring your peer by. Now, that is both being explicit about what you're being measured yourself, but also giving you a way to evaluate any interaction around these criteria. Now, one of the things is, in professional situations, those things are often not, they're implicit, they're part of the culture, they're not explicitly spelt out. And this forces us to spell them out in such a way that they can be then internalized, so to speak. So this the rubric business and the peer review business, it's a significant change from that traditional classroom architecture. Jen?
I think it's interesting, especially in law enforcement, there are so many standards that are established at the federal level and at the state level. And so converting those, deconstructing that set of basic required elements for each standard of performance for a given job is what allows us to bring rubrics into this learning and training environment. Sometimes I think we would do well in this environment to not call them rubrics, because the standards are so well known and that's what people train to. But if we can see that they're one and the same, then I think we really can capitalize on that peer review. One, it allows the trainee to become intimate in the best way from a performance point of view with the standards or the elements of a rubric, because now they are looking and having to apply that and analyze someone else's work according to this set of standards. Right. So immediately their understanding of the standard goes up, because they've, if you will, they've become the teacher. They've become the one who's now assessing someone else's work.
And let me give you one fancy educational technical word for this: metacognition. So it's one thing to think about what you're doing, but the standards or the rubric give you a language with which to describe at a meta level what's happening. So that's important.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're probably ready to move on to number 8 by now.
All right.
Which is learning analytics. So I'll just mention that briefly, that one of the great advantages of these digital environments and these web-based environments is it's possible to keep a detailed record of everything that happens. And if you build in assessment along the way, feedback and assessment cycles, if you like, there can be many, many of those cycles. In other words, assessment is contributing to the learning as you go along the way, but also you can build a kind of a composite view of learner progress. That image there on this slide is of an aster plot. Aster is a type of daisy which tracks progress across a number of measures. So in other words, if one was to take a whole course and there are lots of activities involved, we're doing some videos, we're giving some feedback on those videos, we might be reading some information, doing a quiz, we might be making a post about something that we've experienced and then commenting on each other's posts. We might be just simply reacting to a flipped classroom video that's been presented there. So what we've got in these analytics is 20-something different kinds of things that can be happening in one of these e-learning environments, and incremental feedback, which sometimes it's peer feedback, which the machine is mediated, sometimes it's machine feedback. So one of the advantages of learning analytics is this move to constant and continuous small cycles of feedback, and then building a composite view of your learning progress. There's a huge potential in this area, which has barely been touched yet, and it's one of the research interests we have here in the work that we do.
Yeah.
Jen.
I think that the interesting thing is that basing a portion of the metrics or the assessment of the instruction and how well it's being absorbed by the attendees on machine analytics, learning analytics like this, forces the instructor almost to deconstruct the curriculum and be able to identify where can the student engage with themselves, with their own thoughts, with the material that's being presented, as Bill said, responding to a micro lecture that's delivered online, engaging with each other. And by using this set of analytics and defining the assessment metrics of a set curriculum, that's where it really does tap in back to that adult learning model, where since we are self-directed as adults, we want to know where have I gotten to so far? Am I at pace with the course expectations? And having these real-time learning analytics based on the curriculum that's been deconstructed into these metrics, I think just really engages adult learners in a way that, if you will, the summative assessment that's so often experienced, this is what gives you that daily formative assessment where you are actually responding to your own progress because you can see it through this aster plot.
Now we're going to bring Mary back in now to tie things back together again. So we will move over a little bit and
We have wheels on our chairs.
I know,
Yeah.
exactly.
Well, thank you. What you've heard in this session, on which we call the art of the possible, what can you do in a world that is ever changing and increasingly contested, and when you have such a critical role in community. And I think what the 8 principles demonstrate is how we can harness the affordances of the digital to humanize the experience of learning. And the experience of teaching, of course, because they go on hand in hand, and engaging with each other and the community. Michael Schlosser gave one of the early presentations, and he asked us, or he asked his colleagues in the police force, what are we preparing? Are we preparing officers who are guardians or warriors? And he had a wonderful set of issues that he expressed around the well-being of those who have a mindset either as guardians or as warriors, and how they can balance what's implied by those two concepts in terms of their ethics and their morals and how they behave. Or we can't get to that. We can't get to anything that Michael said unless we transform the learning environment from front-end loading, from learning rote, from the teacher and the instructor not being in complex relationships. And what these 8 principles do is say the technology allows us to do things that we could never do before. Last, of course, was the learning analytics. We can track every kind of performance in the class, outside of the class, in the community, independently. We can know what is happening all the time. but we need to redesign those experiences in a collaborative way as instructors in order to enhance the well-being of the officers who have to go into difficult contexts, but also enhance the experience of the community, the individuals who likewise have to change their orientation to what policing is. And that's not an easy thing to do. It goes together, it's interconnected. It's a long exercise, but if the learning happens in the community as well as in the classroom, it's more likely that the community can see these transitions being part of the evolution of policing in a much more complex world that needs them. So thank you.
So let me just say a little procedural thing about this session and the conference. This session is being recorded. I think probably most of the people who attend the session will be attending it asynchronously via the recording. But whether you're online now synchronously participating or whether you are looking at the video, we encourage you to join the discussion that goes with this page. So it's not really that feasible to have a discussion in this environment, which incorporates everybody and gets everybody's point of view in. Whereas in the online environment, here's one of these things about the online environment, it is. So the video of this session will be going back up online quite soon in the next few hours, we hope. So we'd really like you to go to this session and discuss some of the things that we've been talking about, and we'll be there to talk to you via the chat. Now, it's not a synchronous chat in the sense that people don't have to be there at the same time. Just a little note that what it'll do, it'll trigger an email to us to say go and talk. So it's you know, we'll don't think because there's nobody there. We'll be there for sure. So
in the virtual world, there's always somebody there.
yeah, that's true. No, sometimes there's nobody there. So anyhow, yeah. So I hope you found that this a useful session. A reminder also, there's a synchronous session tomorrow as well. So a reminder to see you then, there and then. But if you can't be there synchronously, you can be there virtually. Also a reminder that we've got some wonderful parallel sessions, some great contributions by people. And also at the introduction, in the beginning of tomorrow's session, we'll talk a little bit more about where we want to be going with this this research network and what we've kicked off with this conference.
So we want to thank you all for participating.
Yep.
And know that we are willing and open to hear your feedback and to get comments or suggestions from you. We are a community of educators, and we learn from each other as well. So thank you.
Okay.
Cheers.
Bye, everybody. See you then.
Is it done? If we don't have a recording
Present.
going on.
I think it is being recorded.
Akash, will you use that to turn off the